Attention, you're listening to The Todd Huff Show, America's home for conservative, not bitter talk and education. Be advised, the content of this program has been documented to prevent and even cure liberalism, and listening may cause you to lean to the right. And now, coming to you from the Full Suite Wealth Studios, here's your conservative but not bitter host, Todd Huff.
All right, my friends, I hope you had a wonderful weekend. We're back at it again, as I promised you on Friday. Here on this Monday, I will tell you here off the top, we will be out next week. We're here this entire week. We'll be out next week. Got guest hosts filling in, Chris Dunham, John Crane, Gary Varvel, and Tony Reffett will all be filling in for me next week as we take some much-needed time. Well, just time off. And you might not think I do, but I know that I do. So, my friends, that's what we're doing, and it's a pleasure to be here this week. I don't like missing, but look, I'm looking forward to being gone next week as well. I've been remarkably consistent on this, which is something that most people who talk about politics never are. They're never consistent, or they're very rarely consistent. There's some principled people out there, but normally it's about scoring political points. But we've been consistent here on this program, and I told you that redistricting is a political process. When Indiana was looking at redistricting here, that's my home state, I was one who was in favor of Republicans doing this. I explained myself on here more times than I can count. I went to the State House and spoke at a Turning Point Action rally where I was hissed at by, I use the word adult very loosely here, an adult woman in the balcony called a fascist, a cheater, and everything else from people who have no idea about politics. They just know that they want to see the radical left's agenda forced on the American people. They don't know why. They just think that it's the right thing, that it benefits them, that they'll get some free handouts along the way, that it will condone their morally bankrupt lifestyle, whatever it is. That's what they believe. And they yell names and call me. I was highly entertained that day. My son went. I don't think he was as entertained. He was mesmerized at the absolute stupidity and idiocy we witnessed that day. But I don't think he was. I was thoroughly entertained. I don't think that he was. But anyway, that was what happened here back in November, December of last year. Virginia is in the process of redistricting as well. This time, however, instead of, in the case of Indiana was seeking a way to create a 9-0 Republican map, a Republican majority in Congress. Democrats in Virginia, Democrats control both the Senate and the House in Virginia. They're looking for a way to come up with a map that is 10-1 in favor of the Democrats there. Now, I want to go through this because the hypocrisy is rich here. Is very, very rich on the other side. And by the way, if you were one of the people who were chanting cheater at the State House at me, I doubt any of you were. Even if you don't agree with me, if you take the time to tune into this program and listen like an adult, you don't behave like that. It's just those people, their only hope is Jesus, I'll tell you that. But they carrying on like fools and so forth. And again, it is what it is. It doesn't faze me. It doesn't faze me. If anything, it energizes me to realize that this is who the opposition is, or at least the vocal opposition. But if you were against Indiana's redistricting, if you thought Indiana's districts were quote unquote gerrymandered, you will be infuriated. Now, if you are objective, and here's your test, here's your test, right? Here's your test. I've been objective here. I said that in Indiana, we can redraw our districts, and in the legislature can. And in Virginia, the legislature can redraw their districts. Now, there are some caveats here. There are some things that require a little asterisk, a little explanation, which we're going to get to. But in general, that's absolutely the case. So I've been consistent. If you were one who didn't think Indiana should, you thought it was cheating, you thought it was fascist, you thought it was whatever else, well, here's your chance to be consistent. You should be infuriated because if the shapes of Indiana's districts were upsetting, then the shapes of Virginia's districts should cause you to virtually lose your mind. And so we'll see. We'll see how consistent you are and how vocal you are in opposing what's happening in the state, the Commonwealth of Virginia. Friends, you know one of the biggest challenges that we as conservatives have is finding ways to ensure that our values align with the way that we live our lives, the way that we conduct business, the way that we invest our money. I love what the team at 48 Financial is doing. They specialize in biblically responsible investing. That means they screen out companies that do not align with their faith, their values, and you're not funding things that go completely against what you believe in. They do the heavy lifting for you, helping you align your investments with your purpose, with your goals, and with your values. The best part is they'll help you find out what your current investments are, how those stack up against or in favor of your values. And so all you have to do is take a quick assessment at 48financial.com/Todd. That's 48financial.com/Todd. And that assessment is going to tell you to what degree your investments align with your values. 48 Financial, because your money should work for your values. And friends, absolutely, it should not be working against them. So, all right, let's talk here about Virginia. Last week, Democrats released a proposed map, a redistricting map in the state of Virginia, Commonwealth of Virginia, 10-1 congressional map. It's currently 6-5. Democrats have the advantage right now. They want to redraw the map so that it basically creates 4 more Democrat districts. It concentrates a very, very high percentage of Republican voters into one district. And Northern Virginia, if you're familiar with the geography of Virginia, if you're familiar with the geography of our nation's capital, you will know that Virginia is tucked up right beside Washington, D.C. In fact, you will remember that 2 states, when this nation was formed, when we were looking for a state, a national capital, 2 states decided to give up land to form the District of Columbia. One of those states was Maryland. The other state was Virginia. And it created a little square nation's capital. It was in a swampland. They drained the swamp, hence the phrase drain the swamp that Trump uses, but they had a little swampy area. They drained it. It wasn't being used for anything productive anyway. Some things never change, I guess. And so we put our nation's capital there. Now, D.C. never expanded really into the Virginia side. And so the Potomac River there that separates Virginia from Maryland and from the District of Columbia, Virginia basically has control of their area that was at first set aside for Washington, D.C. By the way, for the people who think that D.C. should become a state or that D.C. should have senators and all this sort of stuff, the right way to look at D.C., this is just a side note, I'm not going to spend any time here today, but the right way to look at D.C. is to say, if anything, if you're upset about D.C. being its own little district and not part of a state, not having states' rights or whatever, then D.C. should be reabsorbed into Maryland, not created as the 51st or, if you prefer Obama's count, 58th state. But regardless, Virginia is tucked right up against Washington, D.C. This is where you'll find places like Springfield, Virginia, Falls Church, Virginia, places, Franconia. I remember when I was out there, I used to intern in Virginia at the end of the Blue Line train. Blue Line train. Franconia, Springfield is where I would take the subway system on a couple days a week when I would go intern at the Christian Defense Fund in 1999, which is hard to believe it was that long ago. But anyway, those are the places we're talking about. This is metropolitan Washington, D.C. This is where all this, if you want to know where a high concentration of wealth is in this country, it's in these counties in Washington, in the Washington, D.C. area. It is incredibly wealthy because all of the money goes to our nation's capital, and then all these people move to Washington, D.C. to get close to the power, to get close to the favors and, lobbying and all that. Listen, I understand I'm throwing everybody into one bucket. There's legitimate work that needs to be done there. You've got to make sure that you're getting the attention of your representatives and so forth, but there's just a lot of wealth. And they're all Democrats. In fact, if you look at Washington, D.C., it's 92% that voted Democrat, voted for Biden in the 2024 election, something like that. And so it's a bunch of leftists, a bunch of Democrats who say, look, this is a good deal, right? We get to come up here. Yeah, we're voting for the destruction of our country, but we're going to be wealthy along the way. When this country collapses, we'll be in the ruling class and we'll get to remake this country into something that we desire, that gives us more power, that, maybe gives us even some more money along the way. But these people that live in these districts or these areas, this area of the state, if you look at the map, that's created by the Virginia, the legislature. And that's what I want to get into the mechanics of this in a moment. But if you look at the map, it has a ton. There are 5 districts. Let me count. District 8, District 1, District 7, District 11, and District 10. I'm telling you, I don't have a legend here on the map to show me how many miles it is from Washington, D.C., but they've created little slivers. I mean, tiny little slivers of these districts, so that if you can envision Washington, D.C., kind of off to the right, and you can see in your mind the Virginia border to the left of the District of Columbia, just imagine in the most northeastern part of the state, the northernmost part of the state, not the most eastern part, because that's over there by, Virginia Beach and so forth. But this is the part of the state that's tucked up by the nation's capital. They have districts that they can't be more than a couple of miles wide. I don't even know. They're super tiny, and they're right on top of one another. So if you were to be in Washington, D.C., and were to drive northwest, you would pass through District 8 immediately for just a couple of city blocks, it looks like. District 1 for maybe a couple of more city blocks. District 7, which looks like it may just be looking across the street there. District 11, and then you get into District 10. That's what we're looking at here as we... Actually, I'm on the other side of the city. This is all right outside of Washington, D.C. If you left the District of Columbia and traveled into Virginia, you would pass through all of those districts within a matter of minutes. And why? Why do they do that? By the way, let me tell you, they have the right to do this in theory. Let me get to the specifics, because it's not as cut and dry as it may sound there at first. But they know there's a lot of people that live up here, and there are a lot of... they're all Democrats. It's 90% plus Democrat as you get close to the city, as I stated here earlier. And so they're taking these people and they're putting them into districts to try to maximize and outweigh the votes of the people that, as you get further into Western Virginia, not to be confused with West Virginia, the state, but as you get further west, and you get more into the mountains, you get more into the rural communities, the small towns, you get away from metropolitan life where the Democrats reside, you'll find more and more Republicans in that state. And there's other places around the state as well. But that's in general what you'll find in Virginia. And you'll find that they've concentrated basically as many of the Republicans into District 9, I believe it is, as possible, to put them, as many of them in that district as they can so that they can split these districts up. Now, I'm consistent on this. The state of Virginia can do this. The state legislature can do this. By the way, Rod Bray, I hope you're listening. Rod Bray, my state senator here in Indiana, who they did respond to me. They acted all confused as to, wow, we don't know how we missed you, Todd. You sent to the wrong email address. Well, I left several messages. I went in person. Rod wasn't there the day that Turning Point was at the State House for obvious reasons, making a lot of backroom deals, and it just unbecoming, unfitting for a sitting state senator of any party. I'm in the camp. I've shared this with you. It is not personal. This sort of leadership is just completely worthless in the battle that we're fighting. Rod Bray, absolutely 100%. My state senator here has to go. Again, nothing personal, but this is madness. This is madness. He had the power to do this, and he didn't. And now look at what we're dealing with. In fact, if we end up losing the midterms, they need to look in the mirror, the people who prevented it from happening here in Indiana, because it's unacceptable. For some reason, it's just remarkable to me that people can be convinced that a constitutional tool that is at the disposal of a legislature to use isn't used because of some unspoken standard or set of rules that are neither in the law nor in the Constitution. They're not anywhere. It's just some standard that says, well, the other side says we're being unfair. We don't want them to say that. Well, let me just tell you something. If that's all it takes for someone to change their position, is for the other side to say you're a cheater, you're a fascist, you're a Nazi. If that's all that it takes, I mean, forget about what's true and good for a moment and just put yourself in the shoes of the people on the other side. If you know that all you have to do is go to the State House and chant cheater, fascist, and everything else to get these spineless Republicans to do something, then wouldn't you do that every time, especially if you didn't have any absolute moral standards? You bet you would. That's what they do. Our side's over here wringing their hands, being afraid of being called immoral by the most immoral people on the face of the planet, and it's mind-boggling to me. Meanwhile, the left does this. And listen, they can do it, except can they? Because I want to go into the reasons here why they maybe can't do it. There's a little bit more than meets the eye. We're 50 nifty United States. From 13 original colonies, we have our own state constitutions. We have our own state laws. Each state, while absolutely their state legislature can decide the districts per the Constitution, the states may have said, well, that's fine, but here's how we're going to do that specifically. And there are laws on the books. There are rules in the Constitution of these states. Indiana had nothing. They had nothing that prevented them from passing those maps other than politics. And by the way, the outcome is one that will be, well, voters will hold their representatives accountable based upon their votes. And this is the way it should play out. I don't like the result. I think that Indiana Republicans were cowardly. I still am waiting. I haven't had a single person. I've had many people who promised me they could. I have not had a single person explain to me why I was wrong and why it was some moral failure to redistrict in Indiana. I open it up to you. You are absolutely open. And if you really think you got a strong case, you can come on here and discuss it with me. I have some questions I don't think you can answer and explain objectively why it was absolutely wrong for us to redistrict. I think we're going to land actually, I know we're going to land exactly where I say we're going to land here because it's a political process. And I think you're going to agree with me. I think you're going to find through the questioning, if you decide to take on the challenge, you're going to find that that's where this has to land. So, I want to get into Virginia though, but there's other obstacles in Virginia that Indiana doesn't have. And I want to get to those in a minute. Friends, trust in insurance is lower than Congress's approval rating, but Claim Haven is changing the game. They help you prove what's yours before loss ever happens through professional photo documentation and condition reporting. There's no more arguing with your adjusters. Who's been through this process where you've had a claim and it's a nightmare to prove that you have what you have? No more of that stuff, my friends. No more chasing paperwork, just solid documentation to help protect your home, your family, your future. Restore the balance of power with Claim Haven. Visit claimhaven.club. That's right, that's .club. Claimhaven.club for more information about how you can regain control. That's claimhaven.club. All right, let's talk here about Virginia specifically. Now, in 2020, just 6 years ago, my friend, actually not 5.5 because it goes back to the election, but Virginia voters approved a constitutional amendment in 2020. That constitutional amendment to their state's constitution created a bipartisan redistricting commission. That meant that the legislature basically is no longer in charge and having unilateral authority over the process of redistricting. I think this thing passed. It went to referendum. That's the process in Virginia. It went to a referendum, to a public vote, and I think basically 2/3 of Virginians voted for this constitutional amendment just 5 or 6 years ago, my friends, and they're already trying to change that by pushing through these new maps. I'll get to that after the break. I'll explain how this is all connected, and I'll make it, we'll make sure that we understand that Indiana, as an example, had no obstacles other than the political ones to pass new maps. Virginia has a bunch of obstacles that they seemingly are just ignoring here, and I'll explain it on the other side of the break. Quick timeout for me, though, my friends. You're listening here to Conservative Not Better Talk. I'm your host, Todd Huff. Back in just a minute. Welcome back, my friends. We're talking about Virginia and their quest to create congressional districts that favor Democrats in their state. 11-0, my friends. It's crazy. Or excuse me, 10-1, I mean. If they could get 11-0, they would. And listen, I don't blame them for that. I'm consistent here. This is a political process, and we're going to break this down and talk about this, my friends, because where we left off, I told you that in 2020, the state of Virginia passed a constitutional amendment basically taking the power to redistrict out of the legislature and put it into the hands of a bipartisan redistricting commission. This is all gibberish and just blah, blah language to me. What this basically meant was you're going to have a group of rule makers who love government deciding when they could, what the boundaries of their districts would look like. Now, this makes a lot of people feel better because it says bipartisan, it says commission. But again, these things are always created to protect the party in power. This is political insider. This is not a good thing. However, the likelihood that you'll have just a partisan attempt to redistrict willy-nilly in the middle of a decade, as we have here, is much, much less in situations like that. I will grant that. But this past November, they in the Virginia legislature, they called a special session, and they considered an amendment to reverse the amendment they passed in 2020. So think about this. They took the time to pass an amendment in 2020 that said the legislature is no longer going to be in control of this. It's going to be going to a bipartisan redistricting commission. 2/3 of Virginians said this is great, this sounds fair. Give our state legislature, take that off the legislature's plate and put it into this bipartisan commission. It sounds very, very formal. It has to be fair, right? So they passed that. It became an amendment to the Virginia Constitution. However, 2025 comes along and they consider an amendment that would return redistricting authority back to the legislature. Now remember, the Constitution gives the authority to the legislature. The U.S. Constitution gives the authority to the state legislature. In Virginia, the legislature said, listen, we don't want to get into politics here or make redistricting about politics. We want to make sure that it's fair, which I'd love to have somebody explain that to me as well. What fair is when it comes to drawing district lines and so forth. What is the fair shape? Is it a rectangle? Is it a square? Should it include counties? Can counties be split? The term gerrymander, which Virginia's districts that are proposed here are 100% gerrymandered. If you compare this to Indiana's districts, which Indiana's districts that were redrawn here were not gerrymandered. Yes, they were drawn in a way to favor Republicans, but gerrymander traditionally, historically, originally meant a shape of a district that was drawn that's just incredibly creatively got lines going all over the place, and zigging and zagging, real thin areas, real fat areas, real long districts to capture cities or to bypass cities or whatever. That's what the term originally meant. In fact, I told you it goes back to 1812 when there was a governor in Massachusetts named last name Gerry, Gerry, and they redrew districts, congressional districts, and one of them resembled a salamander in Massachusetts. And so they took the name of the governor, Gerry. They took the last half of the word salamander, which was the shape that the district resembled, and they came up with the term gerrymander. Indiana was not gerrymandered. It was drawn to favor Republicans in ways that you could say were not natural. You could make that case. I don't know what natural means, but it wasn't some ridiculous shape that, look at Virginia's. It's not even remotely close to the same thing we did that was proposed here in Indiana. And I will say this. I will admit this part. If Democrats want to try to draw maps to favor themselves, their maps have to look like this because they're trying to take a highly densely populated area because they, of course, have their supporters in cities, and they want to have slivers of that city basically be combined with big parts of the countryside as long as that sliver, those people outnumber, statistically, the Democrats, they outnumber the Republicans out in the suburbs and the farmland and so forth. And so it's going to have to look like this. Republicans don't have that problem. Republicans would split chunks of a city, as they did with Marion County here in Indianapolis, Indiana. They had 3 districts splitting Marion County. But it's nothing like this. Look at it and tell me it is with a straight face. You can't do it. Not and keep your integrity. You can't do it. I mean, this is not the same thing. And I'm not saying they can't do it. I'm saying they might not be able to do it based upon their own laws. And let me explain. In 2025, they had this amendment that reversed the 2020 amendment, which is crazy. Think about it. You go through the process of amending your Constitution. Pretty serious undertaking. 5 years later, 6 years later, whatever, 5 years later, I guess, you're in the process of reversing it. And now they want to undo what they did. Reminds me of an Office snip, snap for those of you who watch The Office and can remember Michael's comments to Jan during the dinner party. Anyway, so the constitutional amendment process in Virginia is as follows. The amendment must first pass the legislature. Then the intervening House of Delegates general election occurs. So pause for a moment. Passes the legislature. Then there's another election, right? There's another election that people get a vote on their representative. So what happens is the amendment passes the legislature. They can introduce that, whatever. You have to then, this is the important part, before that next election, all right? So the amendment passes, there's an election coming up. You have to have that amendment posted for at least 90 days. So it's passed the legislature once. There has to be another election where you can elect people to basically vote for it or against it again. And what this is doing, it's basically saying, hey, look, we're making a fundamental change to the structure of our government. We're amending our Constitution. They've already passed this. Here's your chance to have an election and vote for representatives based upon how they're going to fundamentally try to change our government. So there's another election. You have to see that amendment that they're going to be voting on 90 days before the election so you can say, okay, I understand what it is. I want to vote for people who support it, or I want to vote for people who oppose it. And then once that election happens, the legislature would once again, potentially the new legislature, would pass the amendment again. If that happens, the amendment goes to the voters statewide in a referendum vote. Now, the statutory rule, again, is that proposed amendments must be posted publicly for 90 days before the next House of Delegates election in the state of Virginia. The Commonwealth of Virginia purpose is to give public notice before voters elect their delegates so that they can decide who's going to cast that important second vote. That's built in to the process. Now, November 4th, 2025, that was the general election for the House of Delegates. Because of early voting, and we don't have election day anymore in America, we have election season. Early voting in Virginia began September 19th, 2025, and the House passed the amendment in Virginia on October 29th, 2025. The Senate passed it October 31st, 2025. So it wasn't even voted on, but only days before the general election in 2025. So by definition, the process I just outlined was not followed. So that means it's supposed to be, by the way, it's supposed to be going to a referendum to the people to vote on in April here. But a lower court said you didn't follow your own procedures because if you met the 90-day posting requirement, it would have needed to begin at least in August of 2025 and possibly even earlier if you start with the early voting day, which is September 19th, which I would think is the date that this would have to be done. And the amendment didn't pass until Halloween. So it wasn't posted 90 days before the November 4th election. The first legislative vote occurred after early voting had begun. The procedural timeline was not satisfied. And the lower court ruled that the amendment was invalid and void. Now, the state Supreme Court stepped in and said, well, not to worry, you can still proceed with the referendum. I'll explain that after the break. But I've got to get time out here first, my friends. If you're dealing, by the way, with discomfort or you're just tired of living off prescriptions and managing the side effects, you are not alone. A lot of folks are looking for something natural that they can trust. They've been checking out Kratom from Christopher's Organic Botanicals. Christopher's partners directly with farmers in Indonesia. They lab test everything before it ever reaches your hands. No hype, no synthetics, no funny business. Just the real deal run the right way. Friends, you've heard horror stories. Those come from shady sellers, synthetic garbage that isn't even real Kratom. Start with their Kratom Starter Pack. Use coupon code Todd Huff to save 10% on your first order. Christopher'sOrganicBotanicals.com. That's Christopher'sOrganicBotanicals.com. Truth, tradition, transparency, and time out for me. Back in just a minute. Welcome back, my friends. Time flies when you're having fun. We're talking here about what's happening in Virginia. I'm waiting for the crowd here that was chanting cheaters to stand up and make their voice be heard. I can hear it now. Todd, we don't care about states that aren't our own state. Friends, if you believe in principle, if you believe that this is a matter of principle, you would actually absolutely be shouting it from the mountaintops, whether it favored your side or it didn't. And if you don't get upset about it, I'm led to believe that, well, I guess it's not a matter of principle. So, I'd love to hear the people who were upset about Indiana be upset about what's happening in Virginia. Because if you don't think that the way that Virginia breaks down their districts impacts your votes, when your state won't redistrict and their state will, and they squeeze 4 more Democrat districts, people who, I mean, think about what they're doing. They become a sanctuary state in Virginia in the age of ICE and deportations and drain the swamp and build that wall, which is a crazy thing. And in the world of, or the era of people being in support of these sorts of things, polling going well for Republicans or for people who care about law and order. I mean, you even got, didn't I see Obama? I saw Obama was being interviewed on the NBA's All-Star Weekend yesterday by Reggie Miller. But anyway, that's fine. It is what it is. But I did see, I think Obama's even out there saying that the American people distinguish between legal and illegal immigration. They want a legal path and they want the rules to be followed. It's like, it's right there for anybody who wants to see it, my friends. But this is not what Democrats do when they are elected. They pursue radical policies. They put boys in girls' locker rooms. They put boys on athletic fields with girls. They get them injured. They take their scholarships. They take their state championships, their conferences, and all these things, taking them away. In fact, that was what today's Todd Talk was about. Hillary Clinton had, which you can get this in the Todd Talk in our Inner Circle newsletter. Just go to toddhuffshow.com to subscribe. It's totally free. But Hillary Clinton's in Munich doing some conference on girls just want to have fundamental rights. And her first guest, I'm not even going to tell you. Her first guest to speak as a woman on behalf of women's rights is, I mean, take a guess, but it makes no sense in a sane world. Anyway, so Virginia's got a problem here. The Supreme Court said, the appeal was heard by the Supreme Court of Virginia. They said, look, we're going to let the referendum move forward, but we're not going to throw out this other case, and we're going to look into see whether or not the state procedures were violated, and we may still rule against the outcome of this referendum, which seems crazy to think about. The court's going to allow a vote to happen, a referendum to happen, and you think that they're really going to come in and rule against the will of the people? I mean, it's crazy to talk about, but this referendum the new maps going to the citizens of Virginia is going to happen April 21st here in just a couple of months. And they're going to decide, the voters are going to decide whether what's going to happen here. And so if the legislature can have control over the maps, the legislature regains authority of that, taking it away from the commission, this 10-1 map can be passed. I think it would be passed at that particular point. So they're not voting on the maps per se. They're voting on whether or not the legislature can redraw the maps. And oh, by the way, here's the maps that they're going to redraw. Crazy stuff. Again, for the people with integrity, just be consistent. If you were against Indiana redistricting, I better hear you. I better hear you screaming from the mountaintops, cheaters and fascists in the state of Virginia. Well, Todd, it's not fascist because it's going to the voters of Virginia. Well, did it go to the voters in Indiana? We had arguments about this. We called our representatives. I think our representatives are realizing now that more people were in favor of the maps, the new maps in Indiana, than they were originally. We don't have a referendum process. It's a political process. It's absolutely a political process. And it should be left up to the states. The problem is if you set up your rules, you got to follow your rules. And if you break the rules, you've broken the law. And they're trying to break the law here in Virginia. As I understand it, my friends, I mean, I've laid it out. I've done a lot of research on this. That's the problem. And I don't think they can legally get this done in the time frame that they have. They can do it moving forward, but I think it's pretty cut and dry if the Supreme Court in Virginia decides to follow the law. But what do you think about that? Is there any chance of that? Friends, ever notice how some families seem to have a plan that lasts for generations? It's not by accident. Full Suite Wealth works with people who want their wealth to make a difference for years to come. They bring together high-level investment strategies like private equity, credit, option strategies, couple that with legal guidance as well. They make sure your vision becomes a reality for the people you love today and in the future. If you're looking to do more than just manage money, if you want to leave your mark, build something lasting, take a look at Full Suite Wealth. FullSuiteWealth.com. Build your legacy. Secure your future. Friends, I have to go. Have a great day. We'll talk with you tomorrow. SDG.